Well, this week we have another exciting speaker to give a insight into affordable housing in the United States and in New Jersey. Vito has been a friend of mine for a long, long time. We first met when his youngest daughter and my daughter were in the Indian Princesses together. So it's been a long, long time, and our families really became quite close. Vito has been in Summit since 1971 when he started working for the Housing Authority of Summit. He has been involved in a lot of the major projects in Summit, such as Glenwood Place, Weaver Street, and Chestnut Avenue. And of course, you know what 12 Chestnut Avenue is known as, the Vito Gallo Senior Citizens home residency. He retired in 2005, and of course, like a lot of us, decided not to continue working, but instead went out on his own and became a consultant, and was working for the Rutgers Bluestein School of Planning and Public Policy, and giving courses and giving advice around the northern counties. Currently, he is the chair of the Union County Affordable Housing Advocacy Team, which monitors and implements a 10-year plan to reform local land and regulations within New Jersey for fair housing. With no further ado, I'd like you to introduce Vito.
Thank you, George. What you neglected to say was that I had a title in the Indian Princesses. And I wish the two of us were standing side by side. I was Chief Towering Oak. 5'7" at the time. I'm not sure you can say that anymore. It was a joke. And thanks to George for helping with the graphics here. George is a whiz. I've dragged him to the Summit Historical Society and various and sundry other places to work on this. Well, you got the title and you got my introduction. Let's see if I can move this. That didn't work. Did it do it? Aha. Okay, good. There'll be a lot of aha moments here for me. I just put an outline here to see what this saga is that I'm going to be working on. I want to start with my personal story because this has been my life's work for a long time. And I can pretty much date how I became involved in public housing. And I date it, I have a date, April 4th, 1986. And some of you may know what that date is. That was the date that Martin Luther King was assassinated. I was a graduate student at the University of North Carolina, studying regional planning at the time. I was mostly interested in courting what the young lady who would then become my wife. They proposed her indeed on the Arboretum on the campus. But that day was a sad day, and I was very, very upset. I had planned to go to Washington the next day, and I did. I was there for a Planners for Equal Opportunity program. There was a professor I guess from Princeton, by the name of Paul Davidoff, who was proposing that planners should be less bureaucrats and more advocates for equality in our country, equity. We started the seminar, and it was going rather smoothly. And then someone walked into the room and said, "Gentlemen," and indeed we were mostly gentlemen, or at least we were of that gender. And he said, "The President of the United States has just closed the federal offices, is open rioting in the streets of Washington, D.C." He was right. We stepped out onto the curb, and the city was silent. The metro had yet to be developed at that point, so everyone that worked in the city was in a car or walking on the streets. And windows were rolled up and people were nervously standing in gridlock. What else can you do when everybody gets on the road at the same time? We planners regret that. But what we saw as soon as we walked out is the city was in flames. I attempted to get back to my hotel. I booked a hotel room for the duration of the weekend. The assassination occurred, if I recall correctly, was on a Thursday, and it would have been Friday, and the opening of a weekend conference. The Hex department store, much like a Macy's, a major department store in the city, was in flames directly across the street. So we realized it wasn't a good idea to go stay in that neighborhood. And fortunately, one of my buddies who had driven us from Chapel Hill, North Carolina to the conference said that his parents lived in Foggy Bottom, and why don't we head to his parents' home? We walked out of the city, and I can tell you that all the white people walked out of the city. And as we walked out of the city, all the Black people were walking into the city. It was a moment I'll never forget, because I thought, my God, I'm a refugee. I'm fleeing a war zone. I have no animosity toward the people who are walking into the city, and I suspect they had none toward me, but we all instinctively understood that we needed to get on the right side of the fence. That day, as I walked out of the city, and at night as we watched the city burn, I'm told that there were more than 1,000 fires in Washington that day. And it's not the image that most people have of that day. We have more recent images of seared into our minds on January of 2020, what was going on in the city. But that was a day in which I resolved that I was going to do something about this. And I said, my God, I don't want to live in a city or even a country where I have to flee my nation's capital. This is tearing the country apart. And that's really what started me on this saga. Well, it turned out that I got on that conveyor belt very, very soon, because within a day or two of that, I received a call from on the telephone in the graduate dormitory, the payphone in the hallway. It was from the mayor of the city of Bayonne, Francis X. Fitzpatrick. I still remember his name. He was a force to be reckoned with. And he told me that I'd been hired to be an urban renewal supervisor for the city. I'd applied for that job, like many people take jobs, because I wanted to do something interesting. And I thought that there were things going on in the country that needed to be reckoned with. And one was what was happening with urban renewal at that time. As I was studying city planning, regional planning, as I said. And it just occurred to me that this might be interesting. Well, I was going into Hudson County, mind you. And I was a Hudson County native. I was a Bayonne native. And he said, kid, before you report to work at the Housing Authority, I want you to stop by my office because I am the mayor. So it kind of gave me an introduction to what life would be like working in a city in Hudson County with a political machine and the like. But it was an interesting experience. And my first day at work, I'm at the Bayonne Housing Authority, and I had a flashback to an earlier experience, my first experience in the field of affordable housing. I was born in 1945. I was born before the end of the war. I was actually born between VE and VJ Day. What was going on in 1945 as the war ended and for the succeeding years was an enormous housing shortage in the country. There'd been no housing built during the Depression to speak of, or not a lot of it, certainly not in places like Bayonne. And there was really no housing built during the war. The federal government essentially shut down, and all the resources to run the war were confiscated, controlled by the government. So the housing industry had an enormous backlog of unfulfilled demand for housing. So there I was, and my first memory again of getting involved in housing was I was 4 years old, perhaps 5 years old. So it was probably 1949. 1950. I wasn't much on calendars at that stage of my life, but I do remember standing up to my parents and saying, you have to get me out of this crib. I was in a crib at age 4 or 5, and I'd been outed by my older brother, who told the neighborhood kids on the street that this kid brother was still sleeping in a crib. We were in a 3-room apartment. It was a 2-family house that grandma and grandpa lived upstairs. I slept in my parents' bedroom in the corner in a crib. And I said, you've got to get me out of here. I'm not staying in this crib any longer. I can't do this. I'm being humiliated on the street. And you need street cred to live in New Jersey, at least in that era. They did do something about it. They applied for public housing. There was a lot of housing being built. It was the 1949 Housing Act, I now know. Bayonne was building what ultimately became, I think, 1,800 public housing units. And I remember the day the letter arrived, and my mother was thrilled that she was going to get out of a 3-room apartment with 2 boys living underneath her mother-in-law, probably is another aspect of it. So that was my first introduction. As it turned out, we did not move into public housing. My grandfather put his foot down and said, no son and daughter-in-law of mine, the kids are going to go into public housing. And he built a room. He built a room for me. So I got my very own bedroom as an addition off the house. I was thrilled to see the construction going on. It was my first taste of building housing, and I was fascinated by the opportunity. Why does anybody become a public housing authority director? It's a cute story, but it turns out these were all antecedent events in my life that caused me to go into government work. I spent my whole career in government, and the interesting thing is I got news clippings galore, as George saw in the Summit Historical Society, because the public's very interested in what goes on with their money in their town. So most of you have much more private lives and less heralded in the newspapers, including the Summit Herald, which existed at the time. But I really was primed to go into government and go into housing. In fact, in the 8th grade, we had a civic society, and we met the mayor. We met the captains of industry in Bayonne. That was the Exxon. I guess it was Standard Oil New Jersey refinery, the biggest industry. But we looked at. We went to the newspaper editor. There was a whole series of things that taught me that civics was interesting. And interestingly, I stumbled across a news clipping that year, in my 8th grade class, we were named the 2nd best civics club in the United States of America. So it was quite an experience to be inculcated into housing, into government work, and to see the opportunities. So I kind of had the bug even in the 8th grade. By 11th grade, I had enough courage to stand up and apply to be the mayor for the day of the city. Needless to say, I was not accepted. It was my hubris, I guess, that I would think anyone thought I'd be up to being a mayor. I still never became a mayor. But I got the booby prize. I was the zoning board of adjustment chairman for the day. And I thought, is there any less significant job in America, in Bayonne, than being the zoning board of adjustment? It seems so strange. But what I did was I shadowed the chairman of the zoning board of adjustment, and he was a diamond in the rough, and it was interesting, and he took pride in what he did, and that got filed away until I got to college. I was studying political science, and ultimately decided city planning might be an interesting career to be involved in. It was now the 60s. I graduated from college in 67, and America was burning. 67 was the endless summer of riots in America. So there was clearly a lot going on in that era. Again, back to UNC, back to the Planners for Equal Opportunity, back to getting that first job. The mayor calls me, I go to work, and I arrive at my desk, and I've got 3 people reporting to me as someone who barely knew how to wipe his rear end, quite honestly, at age 20. And my immediate assistant was the zoning board of adjustment chairman. The person who I thought was an insignificant job was now mentoring me from below. He navigated me through the political climate and through the housing authority and the politics of urban renewal and the like. So I was fated to go into this field, and here I am working for the Bayonne Housing Authority, the very outfit that was responsible for my getting a bedroom unexpectedly. You're looking at the outline. Enough about me. I'll talk about my journey, but I think in hopefully less personal terms. you can see I'm going to talk about federal housing policy, a timeline. And I should warn you that I taught a 15-week course on the evolution of housing policy in America from the Great Recession to the Great Depression to the Great Recession. So I know far too much about housing policy in America to do in such a short time. But I'll do my best. I've got 3 slides that will follow on a timeline that HUD produced on affordable housing. Let's see if I can make my way there. Okay. This is the 1930s, and it goes all the way through to the 2010 or maybe even 2020 off the screen. But you'll see, and it's a little hard to follow. I don't know how this is projecting on the screen, but their presidents, Herbert Hoover started the 30s, and of course, the rest of the 30s were taken up by the Roosevelt FDR presidency. But the key thing that happened, as you well know, in the 1930s was the so-called depression. It hit in 1929. And most of us remember, or were taught in school, there was a banking crisis. It was a stock market crisis, more precisely. But it was a housing crisis as well. The housing market had shut down. There were millions of people that were losing their homes or in danger of losing their homes. It was a time when mortgages were balloon mortgages. A home buyer would borrow money from a bank. Maybe it was something like the movie that you saw. What was the movie called? It's a Wonderful Nation. It's a Wonderful Life. And it was a story of the bank failures. What one did is, at the end of the 3-year term of the mortgage, or if you were lucky, a 5-year term of the mortgage, which you'd put 50% down on a home, the money came due. And you had to go to another bank and borrow the money. The banks weren't lending money for more than 3 years or 5 years at most. So it was a crisis when all the banks wanted their money back and people were unemployed. The unemployment rate at its peak, I think, at 25% in the country. It wasn't that high at that immediate moment, but it cascaded into a long downward spiral. That's when the government got involved in housing. And it didn't particularly get involved in affordable housing. Whoops, I lost the slide. It's there. Okay. It got involved. Thank you. It got involved in something called the Home Owners Loan Corporation. The Homeowners Loan Corporation basically saved the housing market in the country. It basically created the self-amortizing mortgage. One could borrow money and could make a monthly payment for a term. Initially, I believe it was 20 years, and at the end of 20 years, the mortgage was paid off. I don't know who in their right mind would have lent money for 20 years in that era, but the answer was the government then insured the mortgages. So it was the era of the FHA program that's somewhere on the slide, and I can find it. This is probably it here. The FHA, one could buy insurance on the mortgage, and that transformed America, because suddenly people could borrow money. They could pay it off over long periods of time, longer than any prudent banker would ever lend money to. And by the way, the government then set up something called Fannie Mae, which you heard something about probably in 2008 when the housing market collapsed again during the Great Recession. Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mac, the various government-sponsored enterprises. But the point that I'm making here is that the government involvement in housing wasn't particularly affordable housing per se, as we come to know it right now, of housing the very poor, but it was saving the homeowners. It was creating the opportunity to build housing, to finance housing, and to restart the economy. And much of this was about, and several of these other pages, things on the chart will indicate that they were talking about the National Industrial Recovery Act. This was about the economy coming back in a country where the economy was in a downward ever downward cycle. So it took enormous effort by the government to create housing. And I guess one of the points I'd make here is that we think of public housing as for poor people, but everybody's home is somehow involved with the government. It's involved with the government policies in Washington, whether it's the House Banking Committee or the Senate Financial Services Committee. It's the secondary market that takes the money, takes those insured mortgages and puts them in the bond markets. And we learned what happened during 2008 when those bond markets went viral with the contamination of bad mortgages that were largely done by the private sector at that time. But that's where we got started in housing. So we're talking less than 100 years that the government got involved in housing, and it came out of the Great Recession. Let me jump to the 1960s, or I'll never get out of here. I waited all those years. The 1960s were a period where the government finally overtly got involved in housing. They set up the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That was done in 1966. I think that's somewhere on this, probably right about there on the slide. Again, it was an era of unrest. I talked about what was going on in 67 and 68. And the government was clearly had gotten involved there, actually got very involved. I skipped the 40s and 50s, but the government got very involved at the end of the war. Not only was there an FHA, but suddenly there was a VA, the Veterans Administration. And I can recall as a youngster going with my parents to look at the possibility of buying a house, which I think would have been $19,000 for a brand new house at that time. And my mother turned to my father, and I was kind of tagging along. And she said, should we take a chance and buy a house? People have been burned badly during the Depression, and they decided they would not take the chance. They never owned a house to the day they died. They were renters their entire life. But there was an enormous change going on in the country during the 40s, 50s. By the 50s, you had Eisenhower as a president, the war general. He'd come back, discovered that Europe had far better highways than we had in America, especially in Germany with the Autobahns. And the National Defense Highway Act came into existence under the Eisenhower presidency. And you might ask, why am I talking about this? Because that's the other major thing that changed America. It was the opening up the suburbs. Now you had financing to build housing. You had a financial system all the way into the secondary market that would finance. You had war veterans coming back and borrowing money with zero down. A VA mortgage was zero down. And as I recall, there wasn't even a cost for the insurance. The government paid the insurance. So the debt to the millions of men who served in were mostly conscripted, but many volunteered to serve in World War II, was repaid with the opportunity to own a home. And it's, many of you know, also to go to college with the GI Bill. But so things happened that had nothing to do with affordable housing, that had to do with opening up the country to an enormous housing boom, to financial vehicles that made it work. And it was only in the 60s, really, that the government got involved in any serious way in housing. At the end of the war, there was a recognition in the 40s of the need to do something about the slums of the cities. Nothing had been built for decades. And so you had the Housing Act of 49, and they had two titles. And the first title was Urban Renewal. And that had more to do with eliminating slums and opening up the cities for new investment. The second title was the Public Housing Program, Title II, and that's what I got involved in, what I spent most of my career on, and what I almost wound up living in, were it not for my grandfather's intransigence or pride or whatever it was that kept us from moving into public housing. I'll try to keep this moving a bit. The period that what I did in college is I got very involved with intergovernmental relations. I don't know why. I was a geek, I guess. The Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations really fascinated me. And what became obvious to me was that the government had set up all these programs, these categorical grant and aid programs, and they were driving everybody crazy. You get a grant to build sewers, you get a grant to do a water program, you grant to build housing. The movement in this country has always been toward the private sector. it's always been toward keeping government close to the government that's closest to the people is the best government. I think most people would subscribe to that. And the government that governs the least is probably most admired in the ethic of this country. And so we went through an era of we went through enormous development in the 60s and early 70s, building public housing. You'll probably never guess which president built the most public housing in the country. So I'll tell you, is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon could not stop the programs because the Great Society had seeded so many programs. He tried to stop it. There was a moratorium, I believe, in 1973 that shut down all federal aid to housing for 18 months. But it needed to be opened up. And we moved into a whole new era of federalism. We talk about the federal government, but as we know today, the tension in the federal government is what is the role of the states and what is the role of the federal government. And so we moved toward a whole nother approach to government, and it was called block grants. I got very involved with this in the 70s. In fact, when I was hired in 68, there was still some talk about what should the government be doing. And the new federalism was, people remember the New Deal, they remember the Fair Deal, they remember the New Society, the Great Society. Nixon's mantra was the new federalism. And it really did change America because it brought most of the programs back to the local level. The government was giving money. I wound up getting involved with the Community Development Block Grant Program that came into force in 74. And I really enjoyed it because I understood exactly what this was all about. The federal government had the money, the localities had the needs, and the states had to give the localities the enabling legislation to do that housing. So it was an opportunity for me to bring federal money back to Summit, New Jersey, a town that certainly sends a lot of money to Washington, D.C., and to address local needs in the community. Let me get to Summit. This is public housing in Summit. I have a couple of slides on the structures. I'm more interested in the people, and you might be interested in who's poor and how do we assist them. But this was actually the third housing project built in Summit. It does bear my name, much to my amusement. Certainly never intended to get my name on a building. I thought you had to die to get your name on a building, actually. But it doesn't look like what you might think of as public housing. And there were lots of interesting things going on. By the way, it was called 12 Chestnut. I named it 12 Chestnut. I started working on that in 1974. This building was completed in 1986. Housing and development in general is a glacial business. So it's a 125 unit building. First tenant was moving in 1986, and I needed an address. And I torn down the entire neighborhood to build that building. I wound up relocating, I believe, 80 families and 30 businesses to do a redevelopment project in the center of town, really moving slums on Railroad Avenue and Chestnut Avenue in town. And so I went to the postmaster and I said, I need an address for the building. And he said, well, Vito, it's the even side of the street. You tore every building down. Pick a number. And I said, I know exactly what number I want, 12. I want 12. And he said, why? He said, because it took me 12 frickin' years to get the building built. I'm very proud of the building. You can see it's an attractive building. In fact, I went to the architect's office and he gave me something called a JPEG, and I only dimly understand this technology. But you'll see here that it was picked by the masonry bricklayers of New Jersey as the best brick built building in that year. I guess it would have been 86, 87. And also as a city planner, I was thrilled that the New Jersey chapter of the American Planning Association gave it an outstanding planning concept award. So I'm very proud of the building. I have to tell you, I started getting involved with bricks as a probably a 4 or 5, 6-year-old. My favorite toy was Brick City. And it's kind of an antecedent to Legos, I guess, where you assemble the bricks. And to get an award for brick building was rich irony for me. The building, that building, by the way, has 125 apartments in it. It's probably the largest apartment building in the city of Summit. And I was keenly aware that I didn't know how to build a building, or the architect didn't know how to build a building for senior citizens. The architect had never designed one. I had never built one. So we spent a lot of time, and 12 years was an education in itself to learn what is senior citizen housing and how do we make it work. And we came up with all kinds of interesting ideas. The building started as a passive solar building, and it still has a great orientation. If I can go back a slide, you can see all those balconies face dead west, so they could get the afternoon sun where people living in small apartments, which are basically 525 square feet of extraordinarily well-designed unit, all one-bedroom apartments. And we spent years working on the building. Most of the best concepts came from the Harvard School of Design, which is an outstanding institution. So, and city planning is an interesting blend of finance and politics and design. And I think a lot of it came together in that building. I have to tell you that the amount of support that we got in Summit to build public housing is probably unthinkable today. But every church in Summit donated to build public housing in Summit. Hundreds of people donated money to get the buildings built as well. The League of Women Voters supported the program. 1974 is when I started working on it. And I went back through the files with George at the Historical Society. 1972, SAGE, many of you may be familiar with SAGE and Summit. Summit, something for Advanced Gerontological Endeavors. I guess people forget what acronyms stand for. I do too. But SAGE had called upon the city in 1972 to build senior housing, and you could see how many years it took to get there. This is a peek inside the building. This is a cover of a national magazine that actually took note of that building and what I was doing with that building. The building at this stage, I can't read the date on this, but it was probably in the early 80s when there's always a date on a magazine cover. But what was happening is 6 or 7 years after we built the building, people were getting frailer in the building. It was very dispiriting to the staff to find out people were falling down in the building, that people were not cooking for themselves. They were having a hard time living independently. And the building is not a long-term care facility. It's independent living. And people came into the building in their 60s. By the way, overwhelmingly female. The building to this day is probably 90% female. Right now, they simply outlive us guys a lot longer than we. I think we're well aware of that. But sometimes you have to go back to that store, I guess, and get a second husband or a boyfriend, whatever, as we sometimes are called. But the enormous amount of cooperation. This was a program. Again, I was in love with. Always been fascinated by where you can find money to build buildings. And that building, by the way, I showed you the picture, was a $9 million building, $9.2 million. And I probably got another $2 million from the Union County through that federal community development block grant program to buy the land. So it's about an $11 million enterprise to build that building for 125 apartments. So you can do the math. What is it? Less than 100,000, maybe it's slightly over 100,000 all in to build that building. And I used every gimmick I could to figure out how to spend that money wisely and get around the government compliance driven process which was HUD. By the way, that program that funded this that aging in place project basically fed people, cleaned their homes, and provided care. And I think we had 25 families in the elderly women, mostly in the building, and it cost at a cost of a little more than $1,000 a year to keep someone out of a nursing home. It was a Medicaid waiver program. So it's amazing when you start digging, and someone like me who understands where the money is and what the process is and how the federal government interfaces with local areas. I was able to do something that costs, I don't think it's be a surprise to any of you to understand what it costs to put somebody in Lantern Hill or into a nursing home today. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Well, the beauty of what I figured out was I already had the building. The building was already subsidized. I had a mortgage from the federal government. The federal government was paying off the mortgage. I just had to pay some payment in lieu of taxes to the city. And all I needed to do was bring the services into the building that already existed. So that for really pennies to keep someone out of a long-term care facility. And that's why it got national coverage, because other housing authorities took note, and other housing authorities in New Jersey realized that I might have been onto something there, bringing those programs into a senior building. The next slide is in case you don't recognize what you're looking at the Lager Harrell Orchid Nursery site. And what you're looking at is a smokestack that warmed those greenhouses. It was was my duty to relocate the Lager Harrell Orchid Nursery to Auburn, Georgia, in temperature controlled vans, because this is breeding stock for tropical plants. And they were desperate to get out of Summit, if the truth be told. The Arab embargo had hit, oil prices were at unthinkable numbers at the time. I think they've gotten higher now. So they needed to leave, and the smokestack was an interesting feature. In fact, the architect who designed that building and designed that lovely senior building that you saw went to a board meeting with me to convince the board to keep the smokestack on the site. Aside from the obvious phallic symbol that it is, I think the architect made the mistake of saying to the Board of Commissioners, "I think it's zonky." And I could see the board looking, "We're not building zonky in Summit." And so it was taken down. It was actually pulled down by wires, and I think a tractor backed up, as I recall. They didn't blow it up. This is what got built on the site. So Lager and Harrell and the Orchid Nursery that we celebrate here at the end of every meeting, and know the roots going back. By the way, it was the oldest continuous business in the city at the time that it moved to Auburn, Georgia, into a much warmer climate, which made a lot more sense to build orchids. I believe they're out of business right now, but this is what got built on the site. It was the second public housing project, and going back in time, called 2 Weaver Street. It did succeed in getting a number rather than a name on that building. What I regret is not in that picture is a tree that's just off the screen to the right as you're looking at the picture. And it's a Meta Sequoia tree. The one thing I said to the architect, I said, "You designed the building, and I've got some ideas on what the building should be like, but save that tree." It was the Meta Sequoia was thought to be extinct. It goes back to time before deciduous and coniferous trees divided in terms of the evolution of plant life and on our planet. And the tree drops its needles in the winter like leaves, but it's clearly an evergreen that didn't quite know what an evergreen was supposed to be. So it was, and by the way, John Lager's grandfather, the person I bought the building from, on the threat of eminent domain, I believe we settled with him, if I recall. John's grandfather went to China right at the end of World War II, just before the bamboo curtain fell on China. And we're still dealing with that issue in the news today, right, between Taiwan and all the stuff in China. He took seeds back to America, and he planted one tree next to the greenhouses. Sadly, it's not in this picture that was at the Historical Society, but I think it's noteworthy that we did save an interesting bit of, and it's still thriving. By the way, it grows about a foot a year. It's a rapidly growing tree. Let me do a few statistics, and I apologize if they're a bit boring, but there's so many stereotypes about public housing, and one that comes to mind. By the way, I asked George to pick these slides. I said, "George, why don't you tell me what you think is interesting? There's all kinds of data available on it." And he said, "Well, people think a lot of undocumented aliens wind up taking money from the government." Well, here's statistics that are quite current on 277 people living in those 120. There are 195 public housing units in Summit. You can see here that 97.5% of all the people living in the building are U.S. citizens, and that 3 people out of 277 are non-citizens. And they're eligible non-citizens. Those are people that have immigrated, but a grand total of 4 in the building. But I think that says something about the program. And also, they're all lazy. They're all, we heard the stories of welfare queens and who lives in housing. But you can see that, not surprisingly, a lot of people are not employed, but there is a 125 unit senior citizen building. of the 195 units. So not surprisingly, there are a lot of unemployed people, or that much like the people I'm looking at right now that are no longer in the labor market. But 66 adults in the complex and there's 70 family units, by the way, were employed, about a third of the people. And there are few households with more than one person working in them, actually very few. By the way, the reason why there's only one working person is the income limits are very low. You put a husband and wife together working, they're over income for housing. The income limits are remarkably low. The question is, well, you're going to overcrowd the public schools if you build low-income housing. You can see how many adults are in those units, 187 adults, and they're only, most of them are living alone. Most households in public housing in the country are single-person households. And you've got this kind of bell curve, I guess you call it, where you've got families with kids and you've got elderly and handicapped people living as one-person households. And that kind of describes who lives in housing. Children, of course, they talk about overcrowding the schools. Well, the 187 families, how many children are there? Well, there's 17 apartments that have one child. There's 7 apartments out of 100. We'll take the 70 family units. There's 7 units out of 70 that have 2 children living in them. And there's 1 apartment with 4 children in the building. So if you tally that, what is that? 20, 24, 25 apartments that have children out of 70 apartments. This gets a little tricky to follow. It's probably hard to read it, but if you just look at the bottom line, the right side as you're looking at it is females. There are 197 females living in affordable housing in the Summit. There are 80 males, if I'm reading this right. 80 males, 197. And that's kind of typical. What surprises me is that the feminist movement in this country has never embraced affordable housing as a feminist issue. But the reality is most people living in public housing all over the country are either single moms or single females. Again, the feminist movement has become, like so many movements, an elitist movement that worries about glass ceilings for executives, like probably your daughters and mine that have been very successful, and making it into judgeships and all kinds of positions like that. Zoning. The story of zoning is an interesting one. We jealously guard zoning in America. We think it maintains the character of our communities. Zoning only goes back to, it's less than 100 years old. The Supreme Court had a Supreme Court decision. We follow them very, very closely nowadays. Almost every day we seem to be talking about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that zoning was a valid use of government powers in 1926. So we're almost at the 100-year mark in the history of the country, where we had something called government regulation of land. And it was argued whether it would be a taking of people. After all, if you wanted to build an apartment house and the government said you could only build a single family house, were they taking value? Was it confiscatory? But zoning seemed to be a sensible approach. The government was struggling in our country with how to regulate land. Before zoning, there were deed restrictions, and a property could be deeded, as it typically was, could only be sold to a Caucasian buyer. So you had that was the reality, and indeed, when the Supreme Court ruled that zoning was a valid use of powers, they'd already ruled that racial covenants violated the United States Constitution. It was, long time past the Civil Rights Acts of the 1860s, let alone the 1960s hadn't hit yet. But the towns resisted it all over the country. There are towns that literally zoned, Baltimore did, it's near a town that you'd be familiar with. They zoned areas for Black people and areas for white people. They literally said these homes can only be occupied, sold to, transmitted, rented to people of the white race, and we could argue over who's Caucasian, who's not. That's a whole nother story. But the book that the cover of the book that I put here, I thought was worth noting. the color of law, because the debate that occurred in this country for a number of years was, well, was segregation just natural? After all, people like to be with, birds of a feather and like to be together. And the cover of the book is actually the Homeowner Loans Corporation's attempt to zone, because they rated every neighborhood in the country as to whether mortgages would be safe. And so the red areas, I believe, were the areas that were of dubious quality in terms of renting. Bear in mind that when the government set up the Homeowner Loan Corporation in 1934 to rescue the housing market, the question became, if the government's going to get involved in insuring these mortgages, they better be safe mortgages, or the government's going to get stuck holding the bag. So the thought was, if it's a homogeneously white neighborhood, it's probably pretty safe. If it's a mixed neighborhood, it's questionable whether it's in transition and might not be a good investment. And certainly if it's a minority neighborhood, or maybe a neighborhood with a lot of immigrants in it, then it might be risky. And so this issue of was this de jure, is segregation done by government edict, if it became de jure by law, or whether it was done by just natural selection that people move separately? Well, the answer is it's probably both. But certainly the government has its fingerprints on this issue of segregation, going back to the whole effort to save the housing market, going back into the time of the Depression. Let me move on to Mount Laurel. Mount Laurel was the Supreme Court decision. I would take it to 1983. That's when Mount Laurel II was enacted by was ruled by the New Jersey Supreme Court. We keep coming back to courts and all these issues we argue over. Seems like the unelected government we have is the court system in this country. They seem to settle a lot of disputes, for better or worse. And in 1983, the Supreme Court of the state of New Jersey ruled that exclusionary zoning is illegal. Now, what is exclusionary zoning? The towns, by virtue of zoning laws that were enacted pretty much, I guess I said, starting in 1926. By the way, the Hoover administration probably was more involved in zoning than any other administration. Hoover was a genius and a great businessman and a scientist and entrepreneur, and did amazing humanitarian work. But he saw the need to resurrect the housing market. And we're talking the era of Red Scares and how would we make America safe and not like Europe going to a socialist model. And it was clearly understood by the leadership of the country that home ownership would be the way to have Americans have a stake in their community. They would own property. They would take care of their property. They would not be looking to demagogues to do what happens in European cities. That would create stability in America. Homeowners would be sober people that borrowed money and paid their debts off, and the like. And so a lot of this the zoning issue came out by deliberate federal policy. And again, largely these homes were financed by government insurance programs and government backing, an assumption of debt and putting it into the bond market. But so here we have 1983, the government ruled that the New Jersey legislature ruled that housing had to be, the zoning could not be abused. And basically what we had was economic zoning. We'd figured out that racial zoning was a no-no, but we could certainly zone economically, and you could create housing for people of means. They could have 1 acre zoning or 2 acre zoning or whatever. People of modest income might get that 1/4 acre with a fence around it. And then people of lesser income might wind up in apartment buildings somewhere. All well and good, except that all the zoning is done at the local level. After all, the government closest to the people is the best government. So New Jersey, in fact, Hoover was responsible for the template that created the zoning enabling legislation that every state in the nation ultimately enacted, giving towns the ability to zone who could live in their housing. By the way, the planners, you might be amused to know this, planners refer to the zoning as Euclidean zoning. Um, you probably, most of the scientists in the room might have a different, and mathematicians might have a different idea of Euclid going back to the Greek era, right? The founder of mathematics and the like. But the reason it was Euclid, we call it Euclidean zoning, is the Supreme Court decision in 26 was Euclid versus Ambler. Ambler Realty, town of Euclid, Ohio. The Supreme Court decision, I've read it, the judge ruled that the apartment buildings and developers' apartment buildings were really parasites. They were taking land that should be for single family housing and they're putting many units on it. They were taking advantage of the system. So there was always a bias in zoning toward single family housing. And quite frankly, there still is. Maybe there should be, but there is. So the Supreme Court ruled that economic zoning, and if you have any doubt what I'm talking about with economic zoning, if you've ever attended a zoning board of adjustment hearing, and we had a speaker talking about that a few months back, one of the first questions that are asked at a planning board hearing or a zoning board hearing is, how many school children are going to be in this development? And they're talking about the tax dollars and who pays to educate these children. Well, obviously, there's a sinister side to this. Where do people with children, where do families that raise children and love their children, where do they educate them? And we've created a layer of problems here in New Jersey in particular with property tax system. So we raise the taxes to run our local governments for the fire department, the police department, and the Board of Education by taxing real estate. So what towns prudently do, maybe illegally do, is they zone out children. They zone out families. They zone out apartment buildings, thinking single family homes bring in more taxes. Then they layer it with regulations saying, we not only want homes, but we want a 2-car garage. We want Belgian block curb. We, think of all the requirements that are put on home builders to build housing, every one of which drives up the cost of the housing and makes it less and less affordable for people of modest means. So the Supreme Court rules in 86. By the way, what happened is the legislature was very eager to get this out of the courts. I think many of the legislature would like to get it out of the courts again. And this is a 40-year-old program that started in 1983, right? So here we're to 2023. And I'll confess that I was very involved in 2015 when the Supreme Court ruled that the Council on Affordable Housing that the legislature set up as an administrative process to get this out of the courts, that I filed an amicus brief in my role as chair of the American Planning Association's Jersey chapter in support of the effort to take the administration of the affordable housing programs and addressing exclusionary zoning away from the Christie administration and away from the bureaucratic system called the Council on Affordable Housing. And if you look at the date, I don't know if you can read this at the bottom, but the Supreme Court decision was, I believe it was March of 2015. And this publication is a cover of a book that I co-edited, a pamphlet, was May of 2015. So we were poised to get involved as soon as we got this defunct housing agency that really, with nothing but a bureaucratic process that became just a full employment act for planners and lawyers to keep housing from being built. But this, so that was a role that I'll confess to being involved with. But so what has happened is we brought and people think that the government is building the housing now. Well, the government builds remarkably little housing. The public housing program at its peak was, I think, 1.4 million units. I don't think it was ever more than 1% of the housing in America was public housing. And given the privatization that has happened with other programs like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, where the government pays money to subsidize the rent so poor people can rent private apartments, that maybe is 2.2 million units. And then the enormous program that came with the financialization of the American economy is the low-income housing tax credits, which is not even run by a federal housing agency. It's an IRS Treasury program where investors, whether through IRTs or banks or whatever, get dollar for dollar credit off their taxes if they provide money to build affordable housing. And again, part of this intergovernmental process is The tax credits are allocated to the states. The states typically have a housing agency in New Jersey Housing and Foreign Housing Finance Industry. They allocate those credits to different projects. That's probably 4 million units. I'm looking at the clock at the back of the room. So the public housing program is a legacy program. We talk about legacy airlines. Public housing is a legacy program. But just very quickly, housing. This is the City of Summit's housing element and fair share plan. And so you can see is the city is adopting a planning ordinance. This is Summit's master plan we're looking at, not the state's master plan, not the court's master plan, the Summit's master plan. And a little hard to read the colors, but I believe the red were existing house, the blue I believe is existing housing developments in the city. Many are group homes, or I think the only housing that I can point to is this little dot here. That's the senior citizen building. And then a number of these sites are zoned as areas where affordable housing can be built by the planning board in the city. This I think is telling, because there's a lot of concern right now about, are we overbuilding housing, and are we building too many apartment buildings? What are all these big buildings going up? I took the train to Newark the other day. Every train station stop had a new apartment building at it, every one of them. These are what we planners call TOD, transit-oriented development. We're moving away from Euclidean planning. We're moving toward mixed-use developments, mixing residential, commercial, retail, going to transit station, near employment. This is an interesting chart because it starts at the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. It goes through to the period of the court decision in 2015 and 2016. What you can see is New Jersey rarely builds more than 10,000 single-family homes in a year. We're a state of 9.3 million people. We vastly underbuild housing. The system is designed not to build. Planning boards fight building. They scrutinize it. They overregulate it. They make it very difficult to build. Typically 10,000 units get built. That's kind of, you could see the 10,000 line there. And the market, but all the, I guess it's orange color, if you're looking at, I'm looking behind my head. That's multifamily. Well, look what happened beginning 2006 when the Supreme Court said the state can no longer depend upon the state government and the Council on Affordable Housing to make sure that every town does its fair share. That's where the word comes from, fair share of affordable housing. We'll let the courts approve the zoning ordinances of the town. So every town goes to court and seeks a declaratory judgment for the lawyers in the room. It says, we want you to declare our zoning is constitutional. And then there's a remedy. The remedy is that the litigant, which was the Fair Share Housing Center that I was a friend of, gets to negotiate before the judge. And you can see what happened. The amount of multifamily housing has absolutely boomed since that period. So the paradigm has shifted in New Jersey. New Jersey is a suburban state. We all love our suburbs. We love the trees. But the effect is that there's a noose around the cities where poor people live, where poor people get the worst schools and the like. The question is, how do you address this? How do you get towns to open up communities of opportunity? And we're all living in communities of opportunity, good schools, good air quality, pleasant living environment, safe communities. How do we open up the suburbs so that they're not just for the privileged or the people that have the winners of the real estate game or even the game of life? So you can see what's happened. We're suddenly building, just looking at this quickly, I think you can see for every 1 unit of single family housing being built in New Jersey, and since 2016, 2 units of multifamily housing are being built. Now, most of this housing is not low-income housing. It's not affordable housing. Much of it is what is called inclusionary housing. And what that means is the builders have been given the right to build higher density housing. And in return, they'll do a percentage, they'll include a percentage of housing below the market, below market rents or below market sales prices. And so there's an internal subsidy, much like when you go to an airline and you get a seat and everybody's paying a different price. that's going on in the housing market in New Jersey right now. It's more regulated than the pricing at an airliner, but the government is basically saying you've got to produce 10% of the units that you build in those multifamily buildings. Maybe 15% is affordable. I mean, there are many different kinds of affordable housing. But again, it's maybe hard to follow, and I'm going to wrap this up as quickly as I can. But this is an advertisement that appeared in the Star Ledger 4 days ago. It's a development that's up, I guess, I think that Montville is up near the New York State border, but it's still in New Jersey. And you can see that a 2-person family with an income of not to exceed $27,750, if I can read it on this little screen, is eligible to get a unit. That's a very low income household. Extremely low income housing. 15% of those affordable units have to be set aside for very low income people. So the way it works is 80% of the next 2 columns are maybe more relevant. This is low income. And so a household of, if I can get on the right line, 46,000, am I seeing it right? You can probably see it better than I can. 42,000? 46, thank you. That's a low income household, not a very low income household, a low income household. 50% of all the units that are built in those inclusionary buildings must be rented or sold to people with incomes, in this case, a 2-person family with an income no more than 46,000. 50% of the units can be built to people up to 80% of the median housing price for that area. And that number is what, 62,000? Am I saying it right? 55, that's 2. Okay, 55.5. So that, by the way, this area median is an odd concept, but the median household is at the 50th percentile. Most of you know more math than I do, but 80% of median is 40%, 40th percentile. So affordable housing in New Jersey is now being allocated to people at the 40th percentile and down. So that's kind of how the system works. The reality is this chart may be interesting. I'll end with this one if I can. Extremely low income, that's the 30th percentile or down. 85%, let me do it this way, 74% of all those low income households, this is New Jersey data, are extremely cost burden. They're paying more than 30% of their income for rent. I'm sorry, 85% are cost burden. They're paying more than 30%. 73/4 of all the low-income people in New Jersey are paying, they're severely cost burden. They're paying 50% of their income from housing. They're taking food off the table or not going to doctors or doing whatever it takes to keep a roof over their head. The last thing you want to lose is the roof over your head. So that's where we're at. I'm going to stop there and give hopefully the 15 minutes for questions. Did I give them enough time? Okay, I'm going to stop then. I hope that's helpful. I'm supposed to say thank you, I think. All right, thank you. Okay.
Ron Weinger, online.
Whoops.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear you. I had 2 questions, but I'm going to bring it just down to one. With the affordable housing, what is the point behind the requirements, whatever number they may be, of putting affordable housing in locations where jobs are few and far between, and like in these neighborhoods where it's commuter neighborhoods, and providing jobs for low income who will be at affordable housing. Just the jobs just don't exist, but there's still a requirement to say X number of buildings must be low income. So you're putting people in and almost enforcing unemployment. I mean, how does that work?
Oh, you have to win the lottery. The reality is there's such enormous demand for affordable housing in this country, and certainly in New Jersey, but most everywhere. By the way, the worst problem in the country is California. The irony is the most democratic states have the worst housing problems. So it doesn't, I don't think you're liberal or conservative. Everybody is very concerned about property values and the like, but you have to literally run a lottery. I was the administrative agent as a consultant here in New Providence, and we would have a handful of units and we get 100 people applying for an apartment. So you have to, you apply to be put in a lottery pool, and we randomly select. We don't even select on the most needy. We just select based upon upon the luck of the draw. That's the reality. Is that your question or not? Okay.
Yes. Oh, apparently so.
Thank you.
What happens when the occupant of an affordable housing unit gets a substantial increase in salary or receives a huge inheritance?
Well, poor people don't inherit wealth. That's why they're poor. By the way, the best housing program in America is the GI plan, good in-laws. People pass wealth between generations. Poor people don't have a lot of wealth, so it's a bit unusual to see much of a bequest coming to a low-income person. But the answer is it depends on the program. In the case of public housing, every year the residents, the tenants' income is reviewed and the rent is adjusted. If a tenant gets a 10% raise, their rent's going to go up 10%. I mean, how many of you would like to get an increased mortgage every time you got a raise? But that's the way the government runs the public housing program. And that works with the housing vouchers as well. They pay 30% of their income in rent. So your income goes down, you lose a job, it's 30% of your unemployment check. If your income goes up, it's 30% of your increased income. So that works that way. Other programs, the state of New Jersey only qualifies you once. And once you're in the building, then that's the category. You're in a moderate cost unit, or again, there's no perfect system. Everyone, if you want to see an imperfect system, look at how the IRS taxes you and the millionaire, and tell me if that's a perfect system. There are a lot of imperfections in these systems. And certainly, that's an imperfection in the program. I recommend to young people looking at Mount Laurel units for home ownership not to buy those units because they don't get the equity increase. You and I buy a house and consider it not only shelter, but tax shelter, and we're rewarded by the tax code. But the purchaser of a low moderate income townhouse doesn't get the equity. They have to sell it to another poor person. That's the imperfect nature of the housing.
Paul Tukey?
Yeah, hi, Vito, thank you. This is such a fabulous talk. These are very complicated issues that most of us don't pay much attention to in detail. And you make things so clear. So you're a great spokesperson for this. Let me ask a question. I suppose on a lot of people's minds these days, at risk of extending the session for another hour, could I ask you to weigh in briefly on the big development project and the controversy in Summit, and both with regard to what the total impact is going to be, not just in terms of taking up all this wonderful open space that we have in the middle of town, but also of all of those wealthy families who are right next to train stations. So it's part of that paradigm. But also, so how it's going to change the demographics of Summit, but also, there is a portion of it that's supposed to be for affordable housing. And so is that being taken seriously?
Oh, I think it is. Let me say, it always comes down to economics, doesn't it? The reason the city fathers and mothers decided to redevelop that area. By the way, the major piece of that site is the present firehouse that's about to be replaced with a brand new building. And I should note that the new building that looms in quite a big building going up just off the Village Green is a $16 million building. I think the intent of the city is prudent to find some way to amortize a $16 million firehouse. And the question was, how would they finance it? So they created a redevelopment area. So the redevelopment law in New Jersey permits towns to create either a payment in lieu of tax formula or some way to recoup some of the money. And all the money that comes from that payment in lieu of taxes goes to City Hall. The county gets nothing. You get a tax bill. There's three bills there, right? The Board of Education, the county, and the city. In a redevelopment project, the Board of Ed gets nothing and the county gets nothing. It all goes to the city. So the city would capture all the equity growth through a payment in lieu of taxes. And the thinking, at least my understanding, and people may disagree, if this goes public, someone may knock on my door and ask me why I said this, but it's a way to address the debt on a new firehouse. So I think that it was well intended. The way it works is that, again, the city's not building a building. A private investor, private real estate firm, a very, very reputable one, was negotiating with the city on that. And of course, the city kept asking them to do more. We could put a public space in here. Could you do this? Maybe a little retail in it. Every time the city put another amenity in it, the builder wanted more and more units. So it wound up being, again, in my opinion, I probably shouldn't say it publicly, but many people would say that it's 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. There are too many units on the site. And I think there's a general acknowledgement on part of the city that many people think it's too big. It's too out of scale with the neighborhood. So I would predict that you'll see a much smaller development than the one that initially the city was about to bless. But I think the motivation was good and the other part of your question is there affordable housing in it? Yes. And if it may be 10 or 15%, something like that, the units. So it's 100 units, there would be 10 or 15 affordable out of the 100. And it was actually a much larger project than that. But as the project gets scaled back, there'll be less affordable housing because it'll be tied to that percentage number. So if it goes down to 50 units, it'll be half as many units affordable, half as many market. But again, it's an internal subsidy mechanism. The builder is not, the Mount Laurel program is doing a public good, if you will, to build affordable housing with no public dollars. It's all being done with private dollars. And so many, just like the low-income housing tax credit, there are no public dollars into those 3 million units that are being built. There are like 50,000 low-income tax credit buildings being built since 1986. I mean, it's enormous growth. You can see the financialization of the economy and how eager private REITs and are to get tax credits to. So there's enormous tax consequence to all of this stuff. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Yes.
Joe Cohen,
I'll stay if you don't get, if you run out of time, I'd be glad to stay a few minutes and then anyone has a question.
Joe Cohen, you have time?
I have a question that was started. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question that was started, but I don't think was answered.
Yeah.
What percentage of affordable housing does the builder, is a builder allowed to build at the lesser cost?
Well, the builder doesn't, sorry.
The affordable part, what's the percentage breakdown?
Well, the builder's not building it as lesser cost. He's selling it or renting it at a lower rent or less sale prices. It probably isn't appreciably different in cost. Whether you may put fancier counters or cabinets in a market rate unit.
But he gets to build more than he would have been able to build.
That's correct. It's the density bonus is the term that we planners would use.
Okay.
So you take a lot that is 4 units to the acre. Let's take which is unusual that you go into that kind of neighborhood. But let's take a moderate income apartment house, a neighborhood where you could build 10 units to the acre, and you allow them to build 20 units to the acre. Then obviously there's a lot more profit in it. You've basically conferred an opportunity to make more money to the developer. In return, the developer has to build a percentage of affordable housing. Again, typically 15, sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 20. It depends on the program.
But then he makes his money and walks away.
Well, it depends on whether it's most of these units are actually rental. If you think about look at the buildings being built, they're filled with yuppies and young professionals and cohabitating couples and empty nesters. There aren't a lot of families or school children in the building, but I'm not sure I'm getting to your question. Try again.
Well, in Watchung, the properties are, as you use the term, zoned for 1.5 acres.
Right.
And we've had a problem with affordable housing I believe it has to be revamped every few years. You have to come with another plan. Well, part of it, they're including a golf course as the available land. Well, that's actually not available.
That's correct.
And so my question is I guess, and I'm all over the place with it, but because this the whole concept just infuriates me.
A lot of people
So-
are infuriated. Yeah.
Well, and the way it was done, it's through the courts. There's no legislation,
Yeah.
is my understanding.
Well, there was legislation, but the system was designed was so jerry-built and that it never worked. And it was regulatory capture. The towns basically killed the thing with process. And they argued and argued and argued and never came to decisions. But yeah, there are flaws in the system. There's no question about it. But at its core, the system that was set up by the state in 1985, New Jersey Fair Housing Act of 85, basically threw it back at the towns and said, you decide what to do. We've got this administrative agency called the Council on Affordable Housing, and they'll tell you what they believe to be the fair share for every town in New Jersey. And clearly there were flaws in that. And I know every person.
Yeah,
that worked
who
on this-
decides what the fair share is?
Well, I'm telling you,
The
there was the Council on Affordable Housing adopted the rules. This is an administrative agency set up by the state of New Jersey under that Act of 85. And the League of Municipalities was very eager to get this into an administrative structure because they wanted to keep the court out of it. So that's what we had from when we think about the dates again, from
85 is close
85
enough.
until 2015. We had 30 years roughly of administrative structure, and it produced about 40 units of affordable housing over those years for the entire state of New Jersey, maybe another 15,000 rehabilitated units. So it didn't produce the whole scale rape of the landscape of New Jersey. But there are mistakes made, there are zoning issues, but largely the decisions are made at the local planning board level. And virtually no town meets its obligation. They just keep kicking the can down the road, and we're about to do that again because the next iteration of the 10-year plan, because it is done periodically, as you point out, will start in 2025, excuse me.
It's now 11:45. I think we have to call it in. One more question?
We'll squeeze one more in.
DJ?
Thank you very much.
Sure.
You really clearly pointed the fact that if Summit had not spent such an enormous amount of money on the fire station, the 16 million, we would not have to blight the area of Broad Street. Thank you for pointing that out, and that shows.
That's my opinion.
I agree,
Okay.
and that shows a lot of incompetence.
I'm not saying we didn't need a firehouse either. They could have built a less expensive
Nobody
one,
needs a
perhaps.
$60 million
Yeah.
fire station. Anyway, that's not my question. My question is there any, because the state is imposing a certain number of affordable housing, I understand that some communities who have trouble, like Summit, finding space, and they are pushing back those the states, and I understand that some communities have engaged in lawsuits
Right.
against the state.
I can explain that.
Can
yeah.
you explain that?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, the 10 municipalities joined in a lawsuit against the state of New Jersey. I was actually at the legislative hearing on this a few months back. I guess it was back in the fall. There's clearly a movement to change the process. That's a bill that they're proposing, actually. They're also there are two things. There are always two bites of the apple. One is to change the law, and the other is to get the courts to step in and do something. I would predict that neither one of those approaches will work. The Supreme Court basically understands what racial exclusion, really economic exclusion might be a better way to describe what we're talking about. I doubt that they're going to change the Mount Laurel doctrine. It's been around for 40 years. The legislature is a Democratic legislature. This has become a partisan issue. Again, this is my opinion. My background's in political science, so I don't see the legislature tackling it. I could be wrong. It's a suburban state, and the suburbs basically have most of the seats in the legislature, not the cities. There aren't very many big cities in New Jersey. I think there are 4 cities over 100,000 people. We're basically at 435 municipalities of suburbs almost entirely. So we'll see where it goes. But you're asking, it's a conjectural question. What is likely to happen here? what will happen is some push is going to come to shove. And somewhere along the line, either the legislature is going to have to do something or the court's going to have to do something. But I predict that we're not going to be able to ignore this problem or kick the can down the road. We're living in a time of reckoning with inequality and inequality and racial issues. So again, but to be continued. I'm glad to stay for questions afterwards.
Thank you, Vito, for such a great presentation. You're a member of the Seminole Guard, so you know the procedure. This is a certificate of appreciation for you, Vito. And thank you for giving us a more up-to-date information about the orchid and where actually it really came from.
Where have all the orchids gone?
And the other way we show our appreciation again is with the Seminole Guard salute.
Thank you. Okay. Good job. Thank you.